Good morning. Today we are going to continue our work with Peter Pan in chapter 5. And we have two goals that we want to be able to do. The first is over on the left, and it's understanding characters' perspectives. Characters' perspective is the way that a character views the events of the story. So if I think back to our previous chapter, chapter 4, we have Peter at the house with the children. Well, if I remember clearly, the children were excited because they were able to fly, they were having a good time. But then we had Nana, which is another character in the story. The event is that Peter is at the house. But Nana feels differently about that event than the children. Nana is upset. She starts barking at Peter. The other objective for us today is understanding characters' traits. So over on the right-hand side, we see the little girl, and we are able to see how she looks, the color of her hair, what she has on. Those are all the things that we can see with our eyes. But then as we dig a little deeper on the left, those are our character traits. That is how that person is, not based on the way they look, but based on their thoughts, their actions, their words. I'm going to continue that work. So if I think about Peter, Peter on the outside, we may be able to describe what he looks like. He is young, he is slim. But then I want to think about on the inside, based on some of the things that he has said and done, what could I say about him? Well, he's teaching the children to fly. So that would be an action that he has done. The children would probably agree that Peter is exciting and fun, not based on how he looks, but based on his thoughts, his actions, and his words. So, as we're reading today, we're going to be thinking about those two things. We're going to think about our characters and how they may be thinking and viewing an event that has happened. And then we're also going to dig a little deeper into our characters and think about their thoughts, their words, and their actions to tell us about their character traits. So, chapter 5 is entitled The Long Flight. If you have your books, you're going to follow along with me on page 33. As I read, I am going to pause in different places so that way we can talk about what we are reading. The Long Flight. Second to the right and then straight on until morning. Wendy remembered what Peter had said, but it seemed that even birds carried street maps, and consulting them at Wendy Corners couldn't have found Neverland with those directions. Those do seem like pretty odd directions. Normally, someone would give you their street house number or the street name in order to find where they live. And so Michael and Wendy and John had no choice but to follow Peter and to completely trust him. So we have these characters who do not know where they are going at all, and they have to rely on their newfound friend of Peter. It seems like Wendy John are awful trusting to think that Peter is going to make sure that they are going in the right direction. Well, it says he led them around in circles, flying past church spires and clock towers and any other tall object that struck his fancy. John and Michael didn't mind. They were having And too much fun flying over the ocean, racing each other between the waves. Wendy, however, was worried. It seemed to her that they had been flying for days now. Was the island called Neverland because they would never land? It seemed a possibility. So we have an event right now that's happening. The children are flying to Neverland. And we have John and Michael, who seem to be, well, even Peter, who seem to be having a pretty good time flying around in loops and circles, seeming like they're going to fly forever. But Wendy is looking at that same event differently. She's concerned. She's worried about how long they're going to have to be flying around. It seems like they were going to be flying forever. She was relieved, at least, that Peter was feeding them, although his way of doing so was rather strange. He would chase birds that had food in their mouths and steal it. The birds would steal it back. And so it went like this for a while until someone managed to gobble the food down. Worst of all, children were getting incredibly sleepy. Occasionally, every now and then, one of them would fall asleep while flying and drop like a heavy stone towards the cruel sea below. Wow, that sounds pretty dangerous. Staying awake is definitely something they need to do. It always turned out all right. Either the other children would shout, "Wake up!" or Peter would swoop down at the last minute to save the falling child. But they came awfully close to the water a few times. So we're thinking about character traits and basing it off of their actions, thoughts, and feelings. Peter would be not have such a negative character trait, but I could probably say that Peter was being thoughtful because he was making sure that the children would not actually crash into the water. One of these days, Wendy thought, Peter might let them fall just for the fun of it, because it would be a interesting sight to see. So Wendy is showing more concern, not only about how long they are flying, but if Peter really will keep them safe. Don't make him mad, Wendy whispered to John. What would we do if he left us? We would go back, John said, but we don't know the way. Well, then, we could go on, said John. We don't know the way either. In fact, we don't even know how to stop flying. John thought about this. Wendy, she was right. Peter had never shown them how to stop. Well, he said, worst comes to worst, we could always just keep going. So, again, character perspective. Wendy is concerned about not only how long they're flying, but what happens if Peter just decides to up and leave them. And John, he's all carefree. He's not worrying about it at all. He feels like, everything is just going to work out all right. The same thing is happening to the both of them, but they are seeing that event differently. And well, he says, worst comes to worst, we could just keep flying. The world is round after all. Eventually, we would get back to our bedroom, don't you think? Peter was nowhere to be found. It wasn't uncommon for him to leave occasionally. It seems like Wendy has plenty of reason to be worried because as they are flying longer, Peter has seemed to kind of forget about them and be doing other things. Easily bored and distracted, he would fly up to talk to the stars or down low with a mermaid. He always came back, but sometimes he barely remembered them, as if he had already moved on to his next adventure. I'm Wendy, Wendy reminded him once when he had flown back and looked at her blankly. I know that, Peter said, but she could tell that he was lying. Eventually, the children learned how to fall asleep without falling. Peter, however, found this to be boring. So he would cry out and wake them up anyway just to see them jump. So before Peter was able to save them, now they're able to fall asleep and not fall. Peter's viewing that differently and thinks, I need to spice things up. At last, they reached Neverland, less due to Peter's guidance, it seemed to Wendy, than sheer luck. Or perhaps the island had been looking for them. There it is, Peter said. He gestured, he pointed in the direction the sun was shining, like 100 golden arrows pointing to the island. So if I read that again, it says the sun was shining like. So it wasn't actually 100 golden arrows pointing to the island, but it seemed like that. So if I think of and illustrate, visualize the sun in my mind, and its sun rays pointing out like arrows, the author's really using this figurative language to show me just how bright the sun is shining. It's to help us to create that visual. Look, there, the coral reef and the tiny hut and the cave, John cried, and my lagoon with the flying flamingos. And there's the hunchback little old lady and the turtles laying their eggs and sewing gnomes, Michael added, and my flamingo with the flying lagoons. Hello, Wolfie, Wendy called down to her pet wolf. Hello, boat. The children also saw and recognized the scary first days at school, trying not to laugh in church, and the pop quizzes that they hadn't studied for, the tooth fairy money, and the delicious chocolate pudding. It was all so familiar. Peter was a little annoyed with the children for knowing so much about the island. He wanted to be the one who knew everything. So now that they finally arrived, the children are a little bit more happy, and it seems that Peter is feeling differently about their arrival, and he is not as happy. Suddenly, shortly, however, the sun went down and the children got scared. Then Peter felt better because they needed him again. Down below, black shadows grew and strange noises could be heard. Out in the open sky, there were no night lights or nanas to keep a child safe. The children were on their own, huddling, coming close Peter, they flew so low now that their toes occasionally, every now and then, brushed the ocean. Something strange hung in the air. All of them could sense it. They don't want us to land, Peter said. Who are they? Wendy whispered, shuddering. Peter wouldn't say. Instead, this island is full of pirates, and their captain, Hook, is the biggest pirate of them all. The boys had been excited about the pirates, but at the reality of them, Michael began to cry, and even John gulped. Of course, Hook's not quite as big as he used to be, Peter added. thanks to me. During our battle, I chopped off his right hand with my sword. So if I'm thinking again about my character traits, it seems that Peter may be brave because he is fighting this big pirate Hook. It has even chopped off his hand, singular, not plural. Now he has an iron claw instead of fingers. If you meet him, you leave him to me. Got it? Yes. Don't say yes. Say, aye, aye, sir. Every boy who serves under me has to say that. Aye, aye, sir, John replied. It occurred to John then that Tinker Bell's light might make it easier for the pirates to see them. John's definitely using that thinker. Tell her to go away at once, Peter, the children cried, but he refused. She gets scared and lonely too, he said. They compromised. They came to an agreement. John would carry Tink in his hat, which he would hold in his hand. This worked for a while until John got tired and Wendy took over. Don't think that this changes anything between us. The still jealous Tink clinked, if only for Peter's benefit. Suddenly, the quiet black sky was split in two by a loud boom. The noise echoed through the dark mountains. It's their cannon, John cried. The pirates have fired it at us. Is anyone shot? I'm not, John said. But wait, where were Peter and Wendy? The wind from the cannon fire had carried Peter far out to sea, and Wendy and Tink blew high up into the black sky. Tink wasn't all bad, for fairies are so small that they only have one for one feeling at a time. When she was around Wendy, the jealousy Tink felt could barely fit. Seeing a chance to rid herself of Wendy, Tink gestured for the girl to follow her. What else could Wendy do? All alone in the sky, she flew trustingly after the fairy to meet her fate. So I have my characters, Wendy, John, and Peter. And then we were talking and working with character traits that could describe Wendy, John, and Peter. If I'm thinking even now about Wendy being willing to follow Tink after Tink has been very unkind to her, it seemed that Wendy is a trusting person. I could also say that Wendy is a worrier because she did a lot of worrying, concerned about what was going to happen with them doing all of that flying. Our next character here is John. So, again, I want to think about well, what character trait could describe John? John and Michael, they were willing just to follow Peter. They were having a good time and they definitely weren't doing the worrying that Wendy was doing. They were more or less carefree. And then we have Peter. Peter is showing us all shades and different ways of how he can be. At sometimes he seems like he's going to be kind to the children, but at other times it seems like he is not going to be kind. He's going to be a little reckless with them. So instead of being able to rely on him to constantly do the same things, he seems to be a bit untrustworthy. We could also describe Peter as being unpredictable because really we don't know what Peter is going to do and when he may do it. So as we continue to read in the days to come, you'll be able to identify other character traits that will describe our characters, how they act, and be able to continue to do work on the perspectives of our characters. So here we have, oh, let me take this off, our review of what this text was about. So, chapter 5, The Long Flight, we have Peter, Tinkerbell, and the Darling children all flying to Neverland. On the way, sometimes they would fall asleep. At the end of the chapter, the pirates had fired cannons at them and they became separated. Well, how does what happened in this chapter build upon chapters 1 through 4? In the previous chapter, Peter Pan had taught the children how to fly. Well, that allows them to be able to fly to Neverland. And in this chapter, they flew all the way to Neverland. We also learned about Neverland in the very first chapter when Mrs. Darling was tidying up the children's minds. And in this chapter, the children have their first glimpse, their first look at Neverland. Now you're going to go to your Google Classroom assignment where you will be answering the questions for chapter 5. If you need, go back into the text to reread, but always make sure you are using your book to answer the questions. I know you're going to do a good job. Good luck.